All right.
All right, let me open and we'll get cranked off here this morning. Father, we're thankful for another day, and we're particularly thankful for a day you've given us to be together, to pray, to sing, to worship, to hear your word taught, to hear your word preached. We're thankful for that you've given us the opportunity to be here safely, and we know that some of our church family is not with us. They're traveling, they're ill, or gone for other purposes. But we do thank you for those of us who are here assembled. We also know that your word tells us that where two or three are together, that you're here, that your Spirit is here. And we know one of the functions of the Spirit is understanding. So we ask that you grant us understanding as we delve into another portion of your scriptures. We ask that you guide our thinking and guide our discussion as we go forward. Again, we're thankful for your goodness, for your provision, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, let me welcome you to Grace Covenant Baptist Church, Monroe, Louisiana. For those of us who are physically here, and for those of us who are joining us electronically, let me give you an unashamed commercial. This is Grace Covenant Baptist Church. We are located on Auburn Avenue between North 2nd and North 3rd in Monroe. So if you're in this vicinity, come visit with us. So this morning, we're going to continue our discussions in 2 Corinthians, and we're going to be looking at chapter 5, verses 1 through 10. And we're going to look at this under the frame of hope. And we're going to look at the reasons that Paul gave us in chapter 4 for why we might lose hope. And at the very end of chapter 4, he tells us why we don't lose hope. And chapter 5 is going to be a continuation of that. Chapter 5 is closely linked to chapter 4. So, and as I was beginning to think about this, I got to thinking about the concept of hope. Hope is an essential part of the human experience. When we lose hope, that can and often does lead to despair. And folks who are in a state of despair often make very bad decisions that increases the difficulty they're in, and in some instances can be lethal. So that's an important concept for us to grasp as we deal with some of the things we have to deal with. And again, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about the song, "Oh God, Our Help in Ages Past." This was written by, who wrote it? Isaac Watts in 1719. It's a paraphrase of Psalm 90. And the first verse goes, "Oh God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come." Now think about the two concepts here. He says, our help in ages past. So we've got the concept of help, and we could also say our help currently as we deal with things. And our hope, so he talks about the concept of hope in years to come. So that translates in, as we shall see, that we have hope in the future. So that's kind of the frame we're going to look at as we go through this. So, now, in service of complete disclosure, I will have to tell you, I approached this with some trepidation. A couple of reasons for that. Paul David and Rudy did such a good job taking us through chapter 4 and taking us through the concepts there. So it's somewhat difficult for me to follow that kind of presentation. So that's one. The other is some of these verses are extremely difficult. There are metaphors. There are mixed metaphors. There are metaphors within metaphors. There are parentheses within parentheses. And some of the grammatical constructions are difficult. So, if any of y'all have read through this, particularly verses 2, 3, and 4, and you can elucidate that, I will gladly relinquish the 4 to you. So, if not, we'll struggle through them. So let us begin. I know we've got some students here this morning. We've got some elementary students and perhaps some high school. Some of us who may remember school. Some of us who've been out of school for a half a century. So let me talk to you students just a minute. You study a block of something, a chapter or a piece of something that you've studied. And then the teacher says the dreaded words, Friday, we're going to have a test. Right? Oh, my. Now, if your teacher is kind, they'll do it on Friday. If they're unkind, they're going to do it on Monday, which ruins your weekend, but that's parenthetical. So, when you get that announcement, there's going to be a test in terms of this block of information. What do you do? Study. How do you study? What's the mechanics of what you do? Huh?
You read it over and over and over.
Yeah, which is what? Yeah, but that's not what we call it. What do we call it? I'm going to do what? Study. I'm going to review. It's not rocket science.
You might review any notes that you have.
Yeah.
Or the actual material.
Yeah. Yeah, you go back to the book, or you go back to your notes, or you go, in some instances, you go back to your recordings. I don't guess anybody takes notes anymore. They record stuff. So we review. So as Judy told the ladies in the summer study, I believe, that you start a class, you start a section with a review. So, with that said, we're going to review. Now, I am not, the term we coined several years ago, I'm not going to exposiate chapter 4, but we are going to go back and we're going to look at some of the major points because 5 is so closely tied to 4. So we need to understand and make that connection. So, one author says it this way. He says, few chapter divisions are more unfortunate than this one, since what follows, and this is chapter 5, verses 1 through 10, details the thoughts expressed in chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. Failure to appreciate this fact unduly complicates these already difficult verses by removing their contextual constraints. So, to put us in context, what's the rule of context? You inductive people, rule of context. Context rules. So we're going to go back and we're going to begin to establish some context of what we're going to see in chapter 5. So, what do we know about 2 Corinthians generally? We always look at author, recipients, title, major theme. So who's the author? Paul. Who are the recipients? Okay, I'm getting dual audio here. Church at Corinth, or 2 Corinthians. Did he write it to the church at Corinth? Or did he write it to the Corinthians in the church at Corinth? Okay, so Judy says to the church. See, we're splitting hairs here, but it does have some importance
To the church.
to the church.
Well, he actually wrote to both. It says, to the church of God that is at Corinth, with all the saints,
Go ahead.
with all the saints who are in the whole of Achaia.
Yeah. So we got one of these kind of nebulous, not really important, although it is, concepts about the church, however that's defined, and the people in the church. So. Okay, so we know who wrote it, we know who he wrote it to. Now here's the tough one. What's the major theme of this book? We've only gone through 4 chapters, so you got to do some kind of looking forward. What would you say is the major theme? Anybody?
Correction.
Correction, okay. Yeah, there's pieces of correction.
I would say that the connection between correction, in a sense, the connection between suffering, pain, all the stuff that he was responding to, versus the power of the Spirit, the ministry, gospel, work,
Yeah, okay.
connection.
So that counterplay between the ministry of the Spirit and all the physical stuff Paul was experiencing. Okay. Which leads me to my next question. What was Paul's state of mind, emotional state, as he wrote this letter? Yeah. How was he feeling? What was he thinking? Again, that's not rhetorical. Anybody remember? What does he tell us?
Paul's state of mind, it seems to me, based on the themes of the sections and the chapters, that he was in a positive state of mind.
Okay.
That he was not frustrated. He was in an encouraging state of mind.
Okay. So some of you read it as him being encouraged. Anybody else get a different sense? Some of the other stuff that he's told us.
Well, I think that he's, as I said before, he's walking very rawly, very openly, honestly through the stages that
Yeah.
he was going through emotionally. And many of those stages were abandonment, pain, and suffering, and all those. However, by the time he's writing this, he's received back from them already that they've repented, that they've come back around, that they've reinstated their love and appreciation for him and for the word. And so I think there's a flow of emotions that he's presenting, but I think the final one as he's writing it is one of, as you said, hope.
Yeah. So we kind of have to look at this in a timeline because he does give us some indications in some of his writings that he's pretty battered, physically, emotionally, mentally. And then, as Rudy said, by the time he actually writes the letter, this has been somewhat resolved, and he's in a more positive frame of mind. So we know that the 2 Corinthians, well, let me back up just a tad. The text that we know as 2 Corinthians, is this the second letter that he wrote?
No.
Probably not. This may be the third or even the fourth letter that he wrote, but we know it as 2 Corinthians. So this is the most personal of all of Paul's letters, and he reveals his feelings in this letter. And it shows that misunderstandings damaged his relationship with the Corinthians, and he was grieved greatly by this. He was also discouraged, but he did not give up, and that's the theme that we're going to frame this in. What he does do, he explains why he and his companions persevered in spite of many obstacles. So we've got, if you'll permit, we've got the yin and the yang. We've got the difficulties and the, so to speak, the solutions. So, okay, now let's review. Isn't that fun? We're going to go back to chapter 4. You might want to just grab your text and like I said, I'm not going to go through this as Paul, David, and Rudy did, but we're going to pick out some major points so we can then contrast them with some other things. So, okay, let's go to chapter 4, verse 1. Now, we're going to start with this. We find this here because Paul gives us a kind of an overview of what he's going to do in chapter 4. He said, "Therefore, having this ministry by the mercy of God, we do not lose heart." So we've seen here that Paul's theme remains the ministry of the gospel, and we spent a good deal of time talking about that, and the Christian responsibility for evangelism throughout the entire world. Now there's another concept here that we saw. We didn't really concentrate on this, but we saw the concept of grace and mercy. Now, these two things are very closely related. They can almost be interchangeable, but they are different. Grace pardons. Mercy is empathic and consoles. Again, this and that. Grace is God's love to the guilty. Mercy is his love toward the distressed. This and that. Now, thinking about our own situation, certainly we have difficulties. I was thinking about this morning. Yesterday was the summer solstice, which means this year is half over. And I got to thinking about, it seemed like only last week maybe we were celebrating Christmas and we're celebrating New Year's and we're anticipating probably the coming year. For some of us, these 6 months have been good, they've been pleasant, they've been profitable. For some of us, not so much. So when we look back on this 6 months, whatever it was that happened to us is a memory. And we either appreciate that or we don't. As we look forward, we anticipate positively or we anticipate negatively. Which brings us back to the first verse of Watts' song. Our help in things past, our hope for things to come. So we've got an additional help, so to speak, for whatever it is that transpires. So we certainly do have some difficulties, some of us in points of time more than others. But in his writing, Paul tells us that he was having far greater grounds for disappointment and discouragement, perhaps, than we have. So let's review. We saw the general theme in verse 1. Now look at verse 2. There's something significant that we find out here. What do we find in chapter 4, verse 2? It's kind of the overall theme. Bunch of stuff in there. What's the overall theme? What exists? Counterfeit gospels. We find out that counterfeit gospels do exist. Now that had importance then. It has importance now. then when we proclaim the gospel, when we talk to folks about the gospel of Christ, we're in conflict sometimes not only with ignorance, but we are also in conflict with false or counterfeit gospels. So those proclaiming these counterfeit gospels are often engaged in a disgraceful, underhanded techniques. And we talked a lot about that, the kinds of stuff that's going on in contemporary evangelical churches. So it's not only dishonoring to God, but it often takes place where? Thinking globally now, where does this happen? Where do your TV evangelists practice?
A lot of them in Texas.
Well, yeah. They practice on television. They practice in the public square. They practice in openly public places. So. Okay, chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. Because of this counterfeit stuff that's going on, what happens?
True gospel is veiled or harder to see.
Yeah. But what happens to us? We're engaged in a spiritual battle with the God of this world. So behind all of these counterfeit techniques and so-called gospels, I put that in quote, is the activity of Satan. He is behind all counterfeit teachings and gospels. He tries to obscure the true message of God. As Rudy said, the true message is obscured. Oh, well, he tries to do that. And places veils over the minds of men and women so they cannot see or understand the truth. Y'all remember all this stuff we picked up in 4? Important things that we saw, that we talked about. Okay, look down to verse 7 through 10. Okay, we ought to remember this one. What's the theme here? Huh?
Treasure in jars of clay.
Yeah. We saw that we're basically weak. He pictures our physical bodies as jars of clay, which is the image of being fragile. You know, we're ordinary folks, we're ordinary people, we have ordinary vulnerabilities. And sometimes, we should be able to relate to this one, sometimes we get under pressure. Anybody in the last 6 months felt like they've been under pressure? If you haven't, you are extremely fortunate. Sometimes we're perplexed. You ever get perplexed? You ever get confused? You ever come to the point where, you know, my goodness, what do I do about this? Sometimes we feel persecuted. And sometimes we're struck down. Sometimes we're discouraged. So Paul tells us in verses 7 through 10 that this is a common thing. It's commonality to all humans. Okay, look down verse 16. So we saw here that because of all these potential discouragements, we know physical wear and tear. This is primarily a spiritual battle, but it causes physical effects, if I can use that word. We get worn down, we get torn down. Because it is essentially spiritual, it does take a physical toll. Verse 17, we saw we have obviously have difficulties. These difficulties are common to all humanity. Now, if we deny that, and some do, we're not being honest. We're being dishonest primarily with ourselves. So we undergo the trauma, and I put trauma in quotes, the difficulties that all people experience in a fallen world. Again, that sense of commonality. We're vulnerable to disease. Anybody been sick in the last 6 months? Anybody been in the hospital in the last 6 months? So we're common to that. We're common to viruses. We're common to other kinds of physical illnesses. We're common to accidents. Anybody had an accident in the last 6 months? I don't think any of us have had y'all's major accident wasn't in the last 6 months, was it? Okay. So some have had major accidents in the last 6 months. Some of us have hit our thumbs with a hammer. So again, commonality. And additionally, somebody hit their thumb? No. Additionally, we have an additional factor here, that sometimes we come under this kind of discouragement, some kind of this attack, this persecution, if you want to speak, because of our Christian faith. Now, I don't know that that's something that we think about a lot, but that's also common to us. It's commonality. Then in verse 18, we saw that it often seems as if we're losing this spiritual battle because of the toll that it's taken on us. Because the odds are so stacked against us. But then at 18 we say that we don't look at the things that are seen. We don't look at these temporal things that are going on. But we look to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. So again, we're back to that this and that. Now, as we delve into chapter 5, we're going to begin to we're going to continue to see some of these same themes, and we're going to begin to develop a counter to these things that we saw in 4 that can be discouraging. We're going to begin to see some. If I dare use this term, we're going to begin to see some tangible things that will counter those things that might discourage us. Okay, enough introduction, enough review. Let's dig into, unpack, use whatever term you want. We're going to take these verses apart. You're thinking, oh no, we're going to do grammar. Well, yes, we are going to do some grammar. Grammar is the spice for text. It enlivens the text. As Rusty says, we see it in, what's the new thing, 5G, 7G, whatever. We begin to see it in its fullest implications. Now, I say that with trepidation because, again, these verses are very difficult. I wish I'd have swapped with Rudy. I'd much rather done his part of 4 and let him do 5. But okay, verse 1. Now we're in chapter 5 now, verse 1. I'm going to read these rather than have somebody else read them. For we know that if the tent that is our earthly body is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Now there's a bunch of stuff in this one verse. So let's take it apart. What's the first word? For. Yeah, I'm reading ESV. You may be reading a different version. Most versions say for. Some do not. So the first word is for. For. Okay. English grammarians, students. Typically, for is what kind of word? What's the, drawing a blank. What do we usually call it? I heard it somewhere. Preposition. Okay. Well, that doesn't really seem to fit here. A preposition shows relationships between words, often indicating purpose, benefit, direction, duration, or reason. So it would kind of fit, but it doesn't really fit with what we're coming out of in chapter 4. Occasionally, for can be a conjunction. Okay, so that makes more sense. We're familiar with that. This functions as a conjunction, and it carries the sense of because. Okay, light goes on. Because of what Paul has told us in chapter 4, particularly those last 3 verses, we now connect that to where we're going in chapter 5. It's like a train. You know, between cars and a train, there's a coupling. If you go back to the beginning of chapter 4, he couples to chapter 3. So now we're coupling chapter 4 to chapter 5, and we're continuing that train, or more specifically, we're continuing that train of thought. So it carries the sense of because, and it's a further explanation of the hope expressed in chapter 4, last 3 verses. Okay, next phrase, next 2 words. We're back in chapter 5, verse 1. We know. This presents us with another problem. Who is we? Paul uses that plural pronoun throughout the book. He uses it a lot in chapter 4, and he uses it a lot in chapter 5. So we have to try to begin to have some understanding of who we is. It can either mean Paul himself, it can mean Paul and his companions, or it can mean all believers. In chapter 5, it typically means all believers, although there are times when he's referring only to himself, but generally it's all believers. So we frame that, we being all of us, know. Now know here is Launita 28.1 or oida. In other places, know is translated gnosko, and there's a difference. Here it means to possess information about, to know about something. Gnosko means to know experientially. Now, there's some overlap, but that's not exactly what Paul is talking about here. He's talking about having knowledge about something. Now, there's another concept here, notice, when he says, we know. Now, notice that these are words of certainty. It's not we guess, we hope, we think, but we know. And that's gonna connect to some of the other things that we're gonna see. It's interesting to note that these kinds of words of certainty are usually only found in Christian writings. You don't typically find that kind of assertion of certainty in other kinds of writings. So, next question. We, us, know, we know something, but what do we know? We know some things about ourselves. We know some things about our physical environment. And from verse 1, what does Paul tell us in verse 1 that we know?
Our bodies are temporary. Our bodies are temporary.
Yeah. We have our first metaphor here. He talks about our physical earthly bodies being like a tent. That's metaphorical. And that it's going to be destroyed, that it's temporary.
Kind of saying, since it's saying tent, I mean, is he making any connection to the tabernacle?
Hadn't thought about that. I got to roll that one around for a minute. Probably not, although he could be.
It's temporary.
Yeah, it was. The question was, is Paul relating the tent to the tabernacle? And like I said, I had not thought about that. But,
Well, there is a correlation in the book of Hebrews that talks about the tent being a picture of the tabernacle in heaven, the one that's not made with hands.
okay. Yeah, we'll come to that in a minute. In Hebrews, there's a correlation between the tent and the tabernacle not being made with hands. So,
I would say almost, it appears that he's not necessarily making this correlation to the tabernacle and the eternal home, but that yet both of those are pictures of something greater. So even though they're not necessarily connected, both are the same, a picture of this.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
yeah, so it's the metaphorical aspect. It's a picture of something else. It's the this and that. I just coined that. I like that. This and that.
You could have this, or you could have that.
All right. Well, we do have this, and believers do have that. So, okay, never mind. I'm going to move on. So what he begins to talk about here, and we're going to see this expanded a little bit, but he begins to talk about that our physical existence is fragile, and it's transitory. It's a concept of durability and it being fragile, and in that respect, our bodies are like tents. Not tents as in a verb tense, but a tent. Now, why do you think Paul would pick this metaphor of a tent? Why would he do that?
He was very familiar.
Yeah, he was familiar. Why was he familiar? He was a tent maker. So hang on to that. We're going to come back to that one. Can you think of any other reason why he might have used that metaphor?
I think it refers to, he knows that Christ had talked before about buildings in relation to our bodies.
Yeah?
He was referring, he was using the term temple to refer to his own body.
Okay. So it's been used metaphorically in other places in Scripture. So he has that kind of background that he may have been using.
Temporary.
Temporary.
Worn
Mhm.
down.
In other places, I'm thinking maybe in Matthew, it's referred to as grass. And we saw in chapter 4, it's referred to as temporary bodies are like what? Clay jars, clay pots. Yeah, clay parts too. So he has he has some scriptural, so to speak, background for using that metaphorically. And there's one other that's possible. At that point in time in the Mideast, people were still living in tents. If you've ever traveled in the Mideast, and I know some of us have, you'll see folks, particularly the Bedouins. The Bedouins currently live in tents. And I'll take a push pause here for a minute. That is really interesting because you'll see this tent that these folks are living in, and there may be a camel stationed out there or goats running around, and you'll see a TV antenna, and you'll see a Mercedes parked beside their camel. So, I mean, it's really kind of an interesting yin and yang there. But I would not advocate going to Israel now, but when things calm down, if you ever have a chance to go, go. It's okay. So now let's come back a minute to this thing that he was a tent maker. So he probably made new tents, but he also probably did what else? If you're not going to buy a new tent, huh? Yeah, he fixed them. He repaired them. So we can begin to see why he would metaphorically describe our aging and deteriorating and hitting our thumb with a hammer body with this old tent that's temporary and wearing out, has holes in it. And as we begin to think about, maybe some of us can begin to feel like that this physical tent that we're in is beginning to wear out. You young folks probably don't experience that. Just give it time. Enjoy the time now when you can eat anything you want and not gain weight, because the day's coming when that's going to change. So, now some people like to camp, and some people like to sleep in tents. Some that may include some of you guys. I have said, some of you have heard me say, that when I got out of the military, I was not going to sleep under canvas anymore. So I do not like tents. They're not satisfying, so to speak. So for me, the metaphor goes something like this: the tent stakes are beginning to get loose. The tent poles begin to sag. The tent itself begins to sag. If it's in the winter, it's cold. The cold penetrates the tent. Now, I know they've got these newfangled sleeping bags that will keep you at a toasty 75 degrees when it's minus 30 outside. But the cold penetrates. So they're not, for me, they're not very comfortable. I'd much rather have a nice, warm, comfortable motel room. I used to tell my buddies when we wanted to go do this kind of stuff, I said, look, I'll go as early as you want to go. I'll stay as late as you want to stay. But when it's bedtime, I want to either go home or go to a motel. So some of us might begin to feel this way as we age. So he tells us in verse 1, we know if the tent. Now we're going to come back to that if, because that's important. That is, our earthly home is destroyed. So he tells us that it's fragile, it's temporary, it's going to be done away with. Then he tells us, continuing in verse 1, is destroyed. So something else we know is that our physical body is destined for destruction. I would think we typically don't think about that a lot. We may feel it, we may have that experiential stuff, but I don't think we think about it a lot. Y'all think about the fact you're going to die? That's kind of morbid. Some people do, and that's a whole nother discussion, but I think typically we don't. But this tells us that's a fact. This is going to happen. If we're physically born, and obviously most of us were, then we're also going to physically die. This is incorporated into our language. We talk about a lifespan. If you've got a lifespan, there's a beginning and there's an ending. There's a this and there's a that. So if Jesus does not return during our lifespan, this physical existence, this physical body is going to be destroyed. Now, the term destroyed is kind of interesting. He doesn't say we're going to die. He says it's going to be destroyed. So our body's like a fragile tent, has a destiny to destruction, either through natural decay, illness, accident, or some kind of, I can't think of the word, some kind of danger. We're going to get shot and killed. So we know a couple of things from verse 1 already. We know that our body is like a fragile temporary tent. We know that that tent is going to be destroyed. And then what's the next thing we know? Next phrase after earthly home.
We have a building from
Hmm?
God. We have a building from God.
Yes. See? Everybody can read. We have a building. So, he's mixed the metaphor. He's no longer talking about a tent. He's talking about a building, and a specific kind of building. This building is from God. Now, we have to go down, and we're going to go there just briefly, but you have to go down to verse 2, very end of verse 2, where he amplifies that. He said it is our heavenly dwelling. So we're going to talk about that a little more later on. So something else we know is that when this earthly tent is destroyed, there is an alternative. There is something else that we're going to have as believers. There's something else we're going to have. Now, we've looked at three truths here. These are three specific truths. These are words of certainty. We know that our earthly bodies are fragile and temporary. We know they're going to be destroyed. And we know we have a promise of something different and better. So these are three truths that we know that we can hang our hat on, so to speak. Why? Why do we know that? We read it in Scripture, but what else? There's something underneath that. There's one underlying factor under all of that.
Spirit.
Yeah. And God said. These are promises that God gave us. And because he promised these things, because he said these things, we know that they're true, and we can, like I said, hang our hat on that, so to speak. Luke 20:36 puts it this way, that we are sons of the resurrection. So it's a continuation of that. Okay, we are about out of time, so I'm going to stop with that. Goodness, we didn't even get through one verse today, so we may be here for several weeks. So we'll pick up again next time, God willing, in this verse, and we'll continue taking this one apart, and then we'll move on. So let me give you some homework. All y'all like homework? When he says, middle of verse 1, we have a building, and he tells us where it's from. What does building mean? It's another metaphor, but what?
House of God,
Huh?
house of God.
It could be. Think about it, because we're going to dig into that. This one's going to be fun. So. Okay, any other thoughts or questions? We're like I said, we got about 1 minute. Anything else?